All right, 11.8, multiple line graphs I want to talk about today. We're going to continue our discussion about data. And recall that data is information, but our brain is information. I should probably spell it right. Our brain is very bad at looking at numbers and figuring out what those numbers mean. So instead, we turn that information and numbers into pictures. And one of the pictures we can use is a multiple line graph. And we're going to be looking again at independent and dependent variables. And recall that independent they do not depend on anything else. And dependent do depend on other variables. This one is usually time. Not always, but usually. And we're going to be putting multiple line graphs on a single one. So instead of one that looks like this, we're going to build graph that looks like this, and there could be a third one kind of going like this. And usually they have should have done them in different colors, so you can kind of see them and figure out. And what we use these for is we use them to look at data that's related to each other. That means if I had two things, like, for example, if I was looking at oranges per tree, and I wanted to graph it on a line graph, I would not want to put the amount of koalas on trees as well. These would not be very helpful variables to look at the same time. However, something that I could graph and compare is I could look at my con percentage per student, let's say my average, in my AM class versus my average con percentage per student in my PM class. And if I looked at this, it could tell me my most hardworking class. Alright, we are going to build a chart together, and I kind of ran out of space on this page, so I'm going to turn the page and show you how I would build one. Okay, we are going to look at the data of population again, because it's a very easy one to look at changes. And we're going to look at subcontinents of Africa, the Americas, and Europe. And we're going to be looking at total population in millions. Okay. We also have year. Up here we have 1950, 1960, 1970, and 1980. Oops. Okay, Africa, we have 228, 254, 285, looks like I made a mistake. Hang on. We should have a lot more of these times. These times are wrong. Sorry, let's go 1950. 1955, 1960, 1965, 1970, 1975, and 1980. Okay, there we go. So then 228, 254. This is why you should probably do your math, not in pen and do it in pencil. 285, 322, 366, 417, 479. Americas, 331, 370, 416, 464, 511, 561, 613. Lastly, Europe, 543, 574, 605, 634, 657, 677, and 694. All right. There we go. We got a lot of data to look at, and I want to build a graph that I'm going to be able to compare these things between. So I'm going to build my graph like this. I'm going to do my best to make a straight line this time on the bottom. And there we go. So what I'm going to do to build this graph is this time I'm going to put my independent variables on the bottom. That means I'm going to put my time down here. I'm going to start with 1950, 1955, 1960, 1965, 1970, 1975, and 1980. And I'm going to put my population on this side. But then my question is, what scale should I use? So I'm going to look real quick. Looks like the lowest I have is around 228. And what I need is I'm going to find my highest. I'm at about 700. This looks like if I go from 200 up to 700, that should fit all of my data in here. So if I go 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, that should work just fine. And I think that's what I'm going to do. 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, and 700. Now I do need to have a key in this case because I'm going to be using 3 lines and I'll need to use different colors or differentiate my lines somehow. So if I have Africa, I have the Americas, and I have Europe. For Africa, let's use orange. For America, I will use blue. And for Europe, I will use purple. So, I'm going to do Africa first. Africa, 228. We'll go about there. At 1950. 254. About halfway. 285, about 3/4 of the way. 1965, 322, about right there. 1970, 366, about a little more than halfway. 1975, 417, a little bit over 400, and 479 in 1980. About there. Now I could use my ruler, I probably should, but since these are small, I'm going to go ahead and connect the lines this way. There we go. Let's do Americas. Looking at Americas, I'm going to start at 1950 with 331, which is about here. 370, 1955, here. 416 at 1960, 464, 1965. 1970, 511, just above 500. 1975, 561. And 613 at 1980. I'm going to connect these lines again. And lastly, let's take a look at Europe. Europe starts at 543 in 1950, 574, 605, 1965 is 631, 1970 is 657, 1975, 677, 1980, 694. Okay. There we go. So then I am able to make some predictions and observations about this graph. Some things that I might notice are that certainly Europe started with the highest population, but it seems to have a much lower growth rate because you can see it kind of flattens out and almost stops growing, which is interesting. If I look at the Americas, it looks like it's been growing pretty steadily throughout. And if I look at Africa, it started with the least population and it continues growing. And there's kind of an interesting little blip in the data where there's a lot of population and then less growth. So I'm kind of curious what kind of happened here in Africa, and I bet I could look up some historical information to figure it out. But it looks like they're all continuing to grow aside from Europe, and I've heard that the European birth rate is down, and that does tend to happen as nations and areas get more educated. They have lower and lower birth rates, which is not surprising because Americas includes a lot of South America, which has some countries that are unfortunately not as stable as other countries. So this is not totally surprising, and I bet that if I continue going from 1980 up to where we are 2017, I bet Africa would continue growing, and it's expected that Africa is going to outpace Europe in the Americas eventually. So now I can that's why having a multiple line chart like this is going to be so useful to look at data. There you go. I hope you join me in building this. If not, you'll definitely be building some of your own in this chapter. So go ahead and good luck.